Chapter 6, Section 7 is the quadratic formula. So hopefully today is a nice day and you remember this because you definitely have seen this before. So in case you haven't though, here's the quadratic formula. The discriminant is a really important piece of that, and that is b squared minus 4ac. So it's pretty much everything right underneath here, right underneath the square root is the discriminant. The discriminant will tell us a lot of things, and especially how many solutions there are. So we'll talk about that in a minute, but it tells us how many solutions there are. So sometimes I might just ask you to say how many, and then you're just looking at that part. In order to use the quadratic formula, it must be set equal to 0, and it helps us find the x-intercept. So it tells us where it's going to intercept the x-axis. So pause if you need to get this information down. Otherwise, we'll move on to example A. So example A says how many solutions. So again, all we care about then is the discriminant, and it is set equal to 0. Okay, a y or a 0 set equal to 0. And in that order, then A is the number on the x squared, B is the number on the x, and C is the number at the end. So in this example, A is 4, B is a -6, and C is a 15. So make sure when you're looking at it, you are looking at the sign in front of it. So if I want to know how many solutions, I'm just looking for the discriminant, which we said was b squared. So -6 squared minus 4 times a, which is 4, times c, which is 15. Now, the most important thing I can tell you right now is to remember that if you have a negative and you are squaring it, you have to put that in parentheses, because -6 squared should give me 36. And when I figure out this whole thing, I should get -204. Okay, so if you get a negative, and this is underneath the square root, can you really take the square root of a negative? Absolutely not. So how many solutions are there? There are no solutions. Okay, so if any time you get a negative on the square root, you are going to say no solutions. So let's try that second little bullet, x squared plus 18x plus 81. Okay, this time a is my number in front of my x squared, so that's an imaginary 1. B is the number on my x, so 18, and C is the number at the end, which is 81. So if I look at b squared, I've got 18 squared minus 4 times a, which is 1, times c, which is 81. If you calculate that out, you should get 0. Okay, and that's the part underneath the square root. So you're really getting the square root of 0. And notice in the formula it says plus or minus. So if you plus or minus 0, it's still the same number. So this time you only get one solution. Okay. So if you get a -1, like in the first example, you get no solution. If you get exactly 0, you only get one answer. Okay. And the only thing we didn't cover is if you were to get a positive number, then you're going to have two solutions. Okay, so negative is 0, 0 solutions, 0 is 1, and any positive number gives me 2 solutions, which is what we're going to look at next. So part B says solve it. Okay, so solve it. First I need to get into standard form and set equal to 0. So first thing I would do is I would distribute my w, so w squared minus 5w equals 3. To use the quadratic formula, I need it set equal to 0, so I'm going to subtract my 3, and now it's in standard form and I can use the quadratic formula. Please note, how do you know when I get to use the quadratic formula? Okay, how do you know? Well, if I have a w squared and a w, okay, you have no other way to solve that when I have a w squared and a w. So anytime you have a variable squared, if you have an x squared plus an x, you need the quadratic formula. Okay, that's how you know when you're going to use it. Okay, an x squared plus an x. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. So my a value here, my b value, and my c value, probably first place to start. A is the number on the w squared, so that's a 1. B is the one on just the w, so that's a -5. And c is the number at the end, so that's a -3. So if I put it into my formula says x equals the opposite of b. Well, if my b is a -5, that's going to make it a +5, plus or minus the square root b squared, put that -5 in parentheses, squared, minus 4 times a, which is 1, times c, which is -3. And this whole thing is over 2a, so 2 times 1. Okay, so you should be able to plug it in pretty simply. Now from here, it's pretty tricky to evaluate it the way you need to get the right answer. Okay, so the first thing you're going to do is you are going to evaluate everything underneath the square root. So you're going to do the discriminant first. Okay, I will check that you get that number right. Try that in your calculator right now. Type it just like you see it. So parentheses -5, parentheses squared, minus 4 times 1 times -3. If you do that all right, you should get 37. Okay, so your first step is to find the discriminant. The next step is to actually take the square root. So you're going to round to about 2 decimals, so 6.08 over 2. Okay, and these are all the steps I'm looking for on your tests and quizzes, so I need to see every single one of these. From here, you need to find your two answers. Okay, so your first answer is 5 plus 6.08 divided by 2, which will give me 5.54. Your second answer is 5 minus 6.08 over 2, which will give me a negative 0.54. Okay, so you're going to have two answers here, which should make sense. Okay, anytime you square root something, you get two answers. One is when I add the 6.08, one is when I subtract. If you are not getting those numbers, make sure you are hitting enter before you divide by 2 or putting those in parentheses, okay, because it's a separate value. All right, so there was our first look at the quadratic formula. Let's try a story problem. Janie, example D, go ahead and read that and then unpause when you're done reading it. Okay, so in example C, we've got a story problem with a goalie, and then we're given a quadratic formula. And the question is, when will the ball be 30 meters high? Okay, well, I have h of t, and I've got t. So hopefully you realize that the 30 meters high is the height, so it should go in for the h of t. So I'm going to say 30 equals negative 4.9 t squared plus 35t plus 2. Okay, because we want to know when, which means we're solving for time. Now again, I'm going to notice that I have a t squared and a t. If you have a t squared and a t, that means quadratic formula. Okay, but in order to use the quadratic formula, it has to be set equal to 0. So the first thing I'm going to do here is subtract 30 from each side. So at the end, I'm going to have a minus 28. Now I have my quadratic formula in the order I need it. So I can tell myself that a is negative 4.9. B is 35, and C is a negative 28. Really important that you're watching your negative signs here. Okay, so we plug it into the formula. X equals the opposite of B, so negative 35 plus or minus the square root of B squared, so 35 squared minus 4 times A, which is negative 4.9, times C, which is a negative 28, all over 2 times A, which is negative 4.9. Okay, so let me see if I can slide that over so you can see that that's a negative 28 at the end. Okay, so first step here is to find out what is underneath the square root. So that is the discriminant. Okay, so again, you're going to type in your calculator exactly how you read this part. 35 squared minus 4 times negative 4 times negative 4.9 times negative 28. If you do that correctly, you should get 676.2. Okay, next step would be to take the square root. So negative 35 plus or minus square root of that should give me about 26 over negative 9.8. Watch your negatives. Okay, to get my two answers, I've got negative 35 plus 26 over negative 9.8 and negative 35 minus 26 over a negative 9.8. Okay, lots of negatives. Use your calculator. Just be very meticulous here. Okay, pay attention to detail. The first one you should get 0.918, and the second one you should get 6.22. Okay. Now the question is, does that really make sense to have two answers if we're talking about a goalie punting a ball? Well, it should, because she's going to punt it. Okay, she's maybe going to punt it from here. Ball is going to go up and then it's going to come back down. So it's going to be 30 meters high at two different spots. Okay, so we should have two answers here. That should make logical sense. We should label this seconds, so I know that you know we're talking about time. Okay. Example D says, when will Jane's punt hit the ground? Well, how do I figure that out? Well, I know the ground would have a height of 0. Okay, so I'm going to plug in 0 there. Negative 4.9 t squared plus 35t plus 2. Okay, so the equation is similar, only our c value is changing. Okay, so I'll do this in a different color so you don't get confused. So now my A is negative 4.9, my B is 35, and my C is 2. So if I plug in my equation, I've got x equals negative 35 plus or minus the square root 35 squared minus 4 times negative 4.9 times 2 all over 2 times negative 4.9. At this point, hopefully you're starting to say it to yourself as you're listening to me. Okay, so you're getting a little bit more used to this. So again, you're going to plug in what's underneath the square root first in your calculator, just like it says. So 35 squared minus 4 times negative 4.9 times 2, and that should give you what, 1264.2 all over negative 9.8. Okay, I really, really hope that you are actually typing this into your calculator and making sure you're getting the same numbers. It's one thing for you to see it, another to actually make sure you are getting the right answers. Okay, I have had students many times say, where are you getting that number? Okay, you'd be surprised how many times you can get the wrong answer. Okay, so make sure you're trying this. All right, so now I've got negative 35. Now I'm actually going to take the square root. So the square root of that is about 35.56. Okay, again, rounding to about 2 decimal spots is perfect. Now I'm going to find my answer. So my first answer will be negative 35 plus 35.56 over negative 9.8. My second was negative 35 minus 35.56 all over negative 9.8. Okay, so you've got two equations there, and you should get the first one should be negative point, oops, I'm sorry, that's the second one. First one should be 7.2, and the second one negative 0.057. Okay, so now we're talking about time, and now we're looking at our answers and saying, I've got a positive one and a negative one. And the question is, when will it hit the ground? So you should realize that it should be after 7.2 seconds, okay? It didn't hit the ground at negative 0.057. Okay, so the earlier question could have two answers because it's going to be 30 meters high at two different times. It's only going to hit the ground at one point. So I want to see both answers. Okay, I want you to cross off the negative one and circle the positive one. So I want to see both, and then you showing me you realize it should only be the positive answer. Okay, so let's try one more. Okay, let's try the accounting driver's reaction one. Okay, so read through that. All right, so the question is, if a car took 200 feet to stop, how fast was it traveling? Okay, so it's telling me 200 feet, which would be the distance. So I'm going to plug in 200 for my distance, and I'm going to be solving for my speed, so I'll be solving for s. Okay, so now again, how do you know what to do? I have an s squared and an s. S squared and s means quadratic formula, but it has to be set equal to 0. So the first thing I need to do is subtract my 200, so my end is negative 196. Okay, so now I've got it set equal to 0. I know my A is going to be 0.0042, my B is going to be 1.1, and my C is going to be negative 196. Okay, don't go so fast that you're running over your negatives. Plug it into the formula. X equals the opposite of B, so negative 1.1 plus or minus square root b squared 1.1 squared minus 4 times 0.042 times c negative 196 all over 2 times 0.042. Okay, next thing should be, you got it, do what's underneath the square root, so find the discriminant. The discriminant on this one should be 34.138 all over 0.084. Next thing you should do is take the square root of that. So I got negative 1.1 plus or minus the square root of that should give me about 5.84 all over 0.084. So now I've got my two equations, negative 1.1 plus 5.84 all over 0.084 and negative 1.1 minus 5.84 all over 0.084. Okay, so our two answers here should give me 56.43 or negative 82.62. Okay, so now read your question. If a car took 200 feet, how fast was it traveling? Okay, it's not traveling negative 82, it's traveling 56 miles per hour. So show me both, cross out the negative, circle the positive, and we should be all set. So hopefully today was a review of the quadratic formula, but you may still have some questions. Okay, so write them down and we'll talk about them tomorrow.